recognized speaker and trainer. For the past 30 years, he has lectured to thousands of attendees at hundreds of conventions, conferences, and seminars with great reviews. Mr. Mangelson is currently writing the book, Independence Forever, 4 Steps to Save America. During years of extensive travel throughout America, Mr. Mangelson has become a true patriot. He is now dedicating his time, talents, and career in training and enlightening audiences everywhere on how to protect and save our Constitution and America's future. Mr. Mangelson is founder of the Glorious Cause of America Institute and serves on its board of directors. GK and his wife Chris are the parents of 7 children, and GK has traveled from Jacksonville, Florida at his own expense tonight to speak to us. Please give a warm Rockville Center Tea Party welcome to Mr. GK Mangelson.
Well, after that, don't you think I ought to feel a pretty big head about myself? Yeah. I'm feeling real good. I have to tell you that, as he alluded to the fact that I've had the opportunity of speaking as a career all over America, and I'll give you some background on that in just a minute, but I have to tell you that out of the, literally, I guess, thousands of introductions that I've received, I have to confess something. The very best introductions that I have ever received were those that I gave of myself. Really good. Then I discovered something. I found out that audiences really don't care how many university degrees or professional associations or designation a speaker has. Usually audiences are only concerned about 2 things. Number 1, does the speaker know what they're talking about? And number 2, how does it relate to you as the audience? Pretty much that's it, right? And anything else beyond that is a bunch of self-grandizement of the speaker, and that's what they do. They do these really nice introductions for the speaker. I remember hearing many years ago about someone that must have felt awful big about themselves, and the story goes, he goes to his wife and he said, "Sweetheart, how many great men do you think there are in the world today?" And she only thought about it for a second or 2, and she says, "Well, I don't know, but there's one less than you think there is." So, ouch. So anyway, I appreciate the comments that you made. I guess the other thing I really want to share with you here is to tell you first and foremost how grateful I am that you allowed me to come and speak to you, because you're going to allow me to actually stand up here and talk about something that is absolutely so near and dear to my heart, and that is my love of this country. Yeah. Are you kidding me? And if you haven't discovered that, by the time I get through speaking tonight, I'll retire. Because I think you'll get the point. It really is a thrill for me to be able to be here. Have you ever heard anybody stand up and say, "Gee, I really wish I wasn't here, but let's get on with it"? You know, so I know it's the polite thing to say, but I needed you to know how really incredible it is for me to be able to have this opportunity, and I really, really thank you for inviting me. I came in today from Jacksonville because I slept in my own bed last night for about 2 seconds. I actually came in from yesterday, from early in the morning from California, where I had the opportunity of speaking to a group of a fairly large group. There was a group down in California that feels the same way you do about America, and they actually rented a theater at one of the malls down there and had the opportunity of speaking to that. And I'm just as fired up tonight as I was when I gave that presentation. So anyway, so here we go. I want to name the presentation tonight Independence Forever, and you'll see where I came up with that name a little bit later on. But we really could add one more caveat to that. It could be called Independence Forever, the 4 Steps to Save America, and you'll figure that out here tonight as well. You know, when let me give you some background. Before, little did I realize, is it too loud? It seems like it's loud.
No, it's good.
Oh, will I start screaming like
you have a speaker behind your head.
I'm going to tell you something. What?
You have a speaker behind your head.
No, that's why. I want you to know that about over 30 years ago, I had the opportunity of starting a career that actually led me here. And it didn't have anything to do with patriotism. I started a tax planning practice and a financial practice where we taught people how to protect their assets and pass them on to those that they loved and cared for when they die intact, and also how to navigate this unbelievable tax code that we have, which we should have never had. Well, that's another story. And you know, did you know that even the IRS doesn't understand the tax code? You know that, right? Yeah. Did you know that recently they did a study where they, you know, when you call up for help on the IRS 800 number, and they say, you know, this call may be recorded for training purposes. Well, they disclosed that they went back and listened to a number of those presentations, hundreds of them. They found that their own IRS agents give the wrong answer 25% of the time. Does that scare you?
Yeah.
So this was really quite of an interesting career. Well, let me just share one more real quick thing. One of the most important things that changed my life, and I like to believe there's things don't happen for a coincidence. I got involved with a group of people who actually help people protect themselves from lawsuits rather than filing lawsuits. We are in a lawsuit epidemic. Did you know that in this country?
Yeah.
I don't know whether you're aware of this or not, but the United States represents only about 5 to 6% of the population of this country. And yet, do you know what percentage of all the world's lawsuits, the entire world's lawsuits we handle right here in the United States? Ready for this? 94%. So, do you think there might be a need to teach people how to protect themselves against lawsuits? It was a wonderful opportunity, but little did I realize how popular the topic was going to be. I started being asked to speak at conferences and conventions and business meetings all over the country, from the East Coast to the West Coast and from the North to the South. I've had the opportunity of teaching in every single major city, many times, and more minor major cities. And you know, my wife looked at the calendar and she found that I spoke in every single state just last year. Now the reason I'm giving you that background is because that's why I'm here. I can't tell you when it happened. All I can tell you is that it happened, and everybody falls in love with America in their own way. But that's what happened to me. I ended up seeing this country in a way that almost nobody ever gets to see it. Do you know that in 1 week, I happened to look at my schedule some time ago, I was teaching a class at the beginning of the week in Anchorage, Alaska. I caught a plane and went to San Francisco and taught a presentation. I caught a plane and went to New Hampshire and taught a presentation. And Saturday I taught a presentation in New Orleans, Louisiana.
Wow.
And it dawned on me, isn't it incredible that that entire span that I covered belongs to the United States of America, and yet look how diverse it is. Can you imagine how different things are in San Francisco than they are in Fairbanks, Alaska? Or whatever. And it's amazing. And all I can tell you is that I fell in love with America. And that started me on an interesting quest. And again, everybody does this in their own way, but in mine, I started to realize, wow, this really is a very special country. How special is it? The more you study about our history, the more you realize it is more than just special. I will start out my remarks by screaming from the housetops that I finally discovered what so many others have discovered, and I'm unabashed in telling you that this is not just the greatest country in the world, my friends, it's the greatest country in the history of the world.
Amen.
And I can defend it. I can defend that point. Given to you, let me have the time, we'll go for the standard. Now, when I get all excited and start talking about this to people, 3 questions come up. And I have the same 3 questions, and I hope that all the rest of Americans that want anything to do with this country and really understand why it's great will come up with these 3 questions. Question number 1. Where in the world did the Founding Fathers come up with these ingredients that made America so great?
Adam Smith, Martha Stewart,
Number 2,
John Locke.
why are we having so many problems? Did we do something wrong, or did the founders just not understand modern America's problems? And number 3, and this was a big one, can we still save this land? Let me tell you how serious that question is. We have thousands and thousands of historians in this country that have gone back and studied the 20 largest civilizations since the beginning of recorded time, every one of them of which blew themselves up into oblivion. And those same historians have found out that we are following the very same path that parallels those countries and those civilizations that destroyed themselves, and therefore it's a very valid question in their mind, can we still save this land? Well, I want you to know that all 3 of those questions we're going to touch on tonight before we're done. So let's get started. Before we really can understand where we're going, maybe we ought to back up a little bit and figure out where we've been. You know, it's been a little over 200 years since the Founding Fathers launched this great land. But I think most people would agree with me that we right now, after having been launched so far a long time ago, our ship of state, if that's okay to use that expression, would you agree that our ship of state right now is very, very far out to sea?
Oh yeah.
And not only
And
are we very
floundering.
far out to sea, we are in some very troubled waters. But I'm going to tell you that right up front that I know that if the Founding Fathers were here, they would tell us these are troubled waters we actually could have avoided if we'd have just stayed a little closer to home to where we were initially launched. So the question comes up right at the very beginning, speaking of the founders, I need to say something that becomes a core fundamental principle of everything I want to talk about tonight. When one studies the Founding Fathers, as they, and you study enough material to see how they actually came up with this whole thing called the United States of America, a studious person will discover that when you understand what happened in the minds of those Founding Fathers, you'll realize that every single one of the ingredients that they set forth for America's formula for peace, prosperity, happiness, and freedom, every one of those ingredients were to the founders of the utmost importance. And today, they'd be horrified to see how many of those ingredients have been totally abandoned or have been allowed to become so seriously eroded they're hardly even recognizable. So that really begs the question, what happened that we gradually, slowly but surely drifted away from so many of the checks and balances that were put into place by the founders that had we have followed them, most constitutional experts today agree that if we had done that, we would have solved the top major 100 problems facing America today. So what happened? Well, you know what? I don't think anybody knows that better than the founders. Wouldn't it have been really great if Brian could have announced to all of you that the founders are going to be here? They're going to be right up here on the front row, and they're going to be able to share with you their feelings and their opinions and their ideas and their suggestions about our current state of affairs. Wow, would that be really cool?
I'll settle for Jefferson.
Well, I want you to, we're going to go there. But the sad part is they're not here. You have the sorriest substitute called G.K. Mangelson that we could send. But since that's all you got, let's make the best of it. I want you to know that even though they're not here, I'm going to make what sounds like a very arrogant statement. I know that even though they're not here, what they would tell you if they were here tonight. Does that sound arrogant? I know that you're saying, oh, he's very presumptuous. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Let me defend myself. Did you know that historians now know, we now know, that of the 20,000, that there were nearly 20,000 presentations that we have the content and the delivery of the founders during their lifetime. You don't think we have some idea about how they felt about things? When you read 20,000 different presentations from all those folks, we got some idea. So I don't think I'm being presumptuous at all. I think we're just doing our research. Yes, I don't think that we're being presumptuous. So I know what they would say. I think they would stand up in front of audiences like this and audiences all across America, and they could be very sincere, and they will say, my fellow Americans, for heaven's sake, wake up! They say, you've got something happening to you that's a disaster course if you continue down this road. They would say if you would wake up, every single American would go back and take the time to literally study like they used to the Constitution from beginning to end, backwards and forwards. And then compare it with the Constitution you have today. Because, ladies and gentlemen, there's a very big difference between the Constitution and the principles that they envisioned during their lifetimes and what we have today. And they would say that if you would compare the difference between the two, all of a sudden you'd discover something. You'd discover that America's problems can be easily identified if you understand what made America great and where you got off track. If you compare the two constitutions, all of a sudden you have the power to discern and understand why we're having the problems. And then you can get us back on track. Then we can restore peace, prosperity, and happiness. And how about this? Eliminate our national debt.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be good. That's what I think he'd say. And then, after that, I think someone in the audience would raise their hand. Excuse me, sir. Can we still save this land? We talked about that, didn't we? Can we still save? How would you like to hear what the founders said on that? I gave that a lot of thought, and a lot of research, and a lot of studying, and a lot of pondering. And I've come up with an answer that I'm absolutely certain about. I believe that if the founders were here and they would ask, can you still save this land? the audience, you could hear a pin drop to hear what they would say. And they would say, my fellow Americans, it is possible to save this land, but from where you are now, it will not be easy. It will require great sacrifice and great effort and some pain. However, the founders would say, if you are going to save this land, it will require that Americans follow 4 critical steps. Not 3, not 2. It's either all or nothing. 4 critical steps. Now, do you think that maybe it'd be a good idea for us to cover those 4 steps?
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Okay, I'm going to do that. You know, that was a build-up, right? But before I tell you what these 4 steps are, I have to warn you about, kind of prepare you for them. First of all, I have to tell you first and foremost that these steps are not necessarily politically correct, and I want to go on record to tell you I really don't care, as long as they're correct. You see, what if we had enough people, and there was a time in our society where they say, in the world, the history of the world, that there were a lot of people that thought the world was flat. Well, I'm sorry. Does it make it flat if enough people believe in it? No, it doesn't matter. What's true is true. And I get people all the time who hear these 4 steps, they actually roll their eyes, and sometimes they walk out, oh, I don't believe that. And you know what my answer is? Well, I don't really care whether you believe it or not. If it's the 4 steps that will save America, that's all I care about. You know where I got some of my courage? Nobody wants to stand up in front of a group and be ridiculed. That's not just human nature. But I want you to know where I got a little courage. I want to tell you an experience that happened to one of my heroes, Abraham Lincoln. This man helped pass this country through one of its darkest hours. You know that on one occasion, one of his cabinet members approached him and told him, he said, President, do you realize you are currently the most unpopular person in America? It is the political kiss of death for a professional politician. His answer, my friends, was a classic and had a great impact upon me. He said, I don't care about being popular. I only care about being right. How amazing would it be today if every single politician that we send back into office had the courage to stand up and say, I don't care about being popular. I only care about being right.
How about one?
There's about one.
Fine. Who is he?
The problem is that's correct, and by the way, we'll talk about that later as well. The fact of the matter is, you're right. I'm not really concerned about whether or not they're popular or whether or not it's politically correct. All I know is that I can tell you that if the founders were here, they would tell you that these are the 4 steps. All right, now that I've said that, I'm going to tell you the next thing. I really hope that you've got something to write with. Because when I go through these 4 steps, it would mean a great deal to me if you would take the time to write them down. I think it will mean a great deal to you and your families and those who value your opinion. I want you, everybody should have a brochure, by the way, I handed it out. I think there might be a place or two where you can write something. So when I give you these, here's what I want to have happen. When you walk out into the parking lot, if somebody said to you, now what are those 4 steps? I want you to be able to rattle them off. But even more important than that, I want to tell you what happened to me the very first time several years ago that I gave this presentation. When I gave this presentation, something happened that I can tell you that was so powerful in its feeling right here in my heart, I couldn't deny that it was there. And I found that it's happened every single time since. And here it is. Ladies and gentlemen, I tell you these 4 steps. You will feel a feeling come into this room. And I'm not going to go in to tell you where that feeling comes from. I'll let you decide that yourself. But I believe you will feel a feeling come into this room, and if you will listen to that feeling with your heart, your own heart will tell you these are the 4 steps to save America. And I've had some people whose feelings were entirely different and opinions were different, and when they felt that feeling and were honest themselves, it changed their lives. So, with that, I think it's ready to start talking about what are the 4 steps. Okay, you ready? First and foremost, I will tell you, if the founders were here, they will tell you, you will never save this land if we cannot first and foremost again recognize that our freedoms are a gift from heaven. Did you know the founding fathers did? They testified again and again that our the formula that they established for peace, prosperity, and happiness, and for freedom, that was inspired from heaven. And of all the people that should know, they were the first ones that created the first people to survive as a nation in modern times, and they said it wasn't a coincidence. They said our unique form of government in our Constitution was a gift from the heavens. We're going to spend more time about that as we go through the presentation. And so that becomes really important. Now, to illustrate that point, they also continued to justify their point of view by saying that as they became involved in putting this country together, they were astonished to look back over even centuries of time. Well over 100 years. Do you know that from the time they first landed in Jamestown until they actually got the Constitution put together was 180 years. A little over 180 years. And they found that over that period of time, and even before, the founders said there were amazing miracles that if you just sit back and look behind you, you can't deny it. There was a tapestry of events critical at the right time in the right place that led up to this country being the country that it was. They said it is an incredible miracle to understand that the Creator intended this country to be what it was and how it was to be, and they could see this amazing tapestry of events occurring. Hundreds of miracles. I'm only going to tell you one, just to illustrate my point, because it's one of my favorite stories. I want to tell you a story about one of my heroes, George Washington. I'm going to tell you right up front, I love this man. I've studied him for over 40 years. I want to tell you a story that took place when he was only 22 years of age. Now, he must have exemplified a tremendous amount of leadership ability, because at age 22 he'd already been promoted to the full rank of colonel by the British Army. In fact, we now know that by the time he was 18 he'd already been promoted to the full rank of major. Now, at that particular time, we have to remember that France was at war with England, and so it makes perfect sense that young George would have participated in several French-Indian War battles. And one of those battles was known as the Battle of Monongahela, a beautiful Indian name. It took place right up near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It took place on July the 9th, 1755. Now, we know that on that particular day, George Washington and a very sizable number of officers, we know there were about 80 officers in total, including none other than the famous General Braddock himself, and they were given the responsibility of moving about 1,500 troops through the thick, dense forest when they were viciously ambushed. And I can't think of a better word to describe the blood and the carnage that took place that day than the word ambush. The French and the Indians attacked them from behind trees and boulders and bushes, and it didn't take long before it became apparent this was going to be a devastating loss to the British. We know that within 2 hours, nearly half of the troops were hewn down. They were either been killed or they were so sick they couldn't stand up. But there is a reason I'm telling you this story. On that particular day, you should know that virtually, without exception, every single officer was meticulously taken down, except for one, George Washington. Even Washington recognized that something really weird was going on besides a whole lot more than luck or coincidence. You know, following that battle, he wrote his own brother John. And he says, "By the all-powerful dispensations of Providence, I've been protected beyond all human probability or expectation." Get this. "For I had 4 bullets through my coat. 2 horses shot from under me. And yet I escaped unharmed, though death was leveling my companions on every side of me." Yes, he knew that somehow his life had been protected by a lot more than just luck. But you know what? He still didn't understand the significance of the miracle until about 15 years later. It was at that time when Washington and a group of men were locating lands in what today would be Ohio and West Virginia when they were approached by a band of Indians. They told Washington that the great chief of all the chiefs was camped a short distance away, and invited Washington and his men for a council fire. We now know Washington said that when he attended that council fire, he said during that meeting, he says, one old Indian came forward and through an interpreter told an amazing story. "I am a chief and ruler of many tribes," he said. "My influence extends from the waters of the Great Lakes to the far blue mountains. I've traveled a long and weary path," he said, "that I might see the young warrior of that great battle. It was on that day," he said, "when the white man's blood mixed with the streams of our forest that I first beheld this chief." And then he said, "I called my young men together and said, 'Quick, let your aim be certain that he dies.' Our rifles were leveled," he said. "Rifles which but for him knew not know how to miss. 'Twas all in vain," he said. "A power mightier than we shielded him from harm. He cannot die in battle." And then he said, "I am old, and soon shall be called to the great council fire of my fathers in the land of shades. But ere I go, there is something bids me speak in the voice of prophecy. Listen," he said, "the Great Spirit protects that man and guides his destinies. He shall be the chief of nations, and people yet unborn will hail him as the founder of a mighty empire." Close quote. Little did Washington realize that within only a few short years that he would end up being asked to be the commander of the Revolutionary War. And then also later he would end up being the only person that could have pulled it together to have the Constitutional Convention that turned out to be the greatest convocation of politicians ever in the history of the world. And if that wasn't enough, the God in heaven had another special role for him. Within a few decades of this incident occurring, he was chosen to be the first president of the mightiest empire in the history of the world, truly making him chief of nations. And yes, today, over 225 years later, people still continue to hail him as the founder of a mighty empire. Yes, he knew on that day that a mighty miracle had occurred, but you need to know that the miracles did not cease. By the way, how many of you like that story?
Yeah.
All right. My partners and I put together a company I'm going to tell you a little bit about later called the Glorious Cause of America Institute. And one of my partners, Don Pendleton, loves these stories so much, he started to accumulate them and has put together a little booklet called Miracles, Moments, and Men That Forged America. And here's what happens when I show you a little bit later about how to access our website. You can read them for free. It's on a blog. And we keep adding stories to it. So if you like that, they're all available on our website. Now I started to tell you that the miracles still did not cease for George Washington. You know that during the Revolutionary War, we now know that he was a very meticulous commander. He kept very meticulous notes of his battles. And the reason I mention this is that most people do not realize, and we need to understand, did you know that George Washington wrote Congress 67 times? Not 2 or 3, not 5 or 6, maybe a dozen, just because of a coincidence. He wrote to Congress specifically 67 times and said that in every respect, academically speaking, logistically speaking, financially speaking, and especially, he said, militarily speaking, we should have suffered disaster had not, he said, the hand of God been extended on behalf of this country's struggle for independence. I want you to know in the 40 years that I've studied this man, I've come to know him like most people don't know him, and it's unfortunate because it's available for anybody to read. But I'm going to put in my 2 cents worth because I believe the day will come when I will meet with George Washington. And it will be a great honor. And when I meet with him, if I did not tell you what I'm going to tell you now, he will say, "Why didn't you tell the people?" My friends, George Washington did not just believe in God. He knew there was a God. And he knew that our freedoms were a gift from heaven. And having said that, I'd like to give you a quote that I wish we could put up on every billboard in America, because most people don't realize what an important statement he just made, he's going to make. He said, "I am sure there never was a people who had more reason to acknowledge a divine interposition into their affairs than those of the United States of America." And that's the reason why, folks, I tell you that I am certain that if the Founding Fathers were here, as sure as they knew that, they want to make sure we know. They would say, "My fellow Americans, please go home and in your own private way, humble yourselves and thank the God in heaven that you have the freedoms you do," because they would say, if you cannot do that, we may have already offended the Creator to the point that, having left us now to our own devices due to our own ingratitude, we can start to continue to solve our own problems in our own stupid, puny way. And they would tell us that if you think you've lost your freedoms already, you will continue to do so at an avalanche rate. If we cannot even perform the most important first step to save America, and that is, we must first and foremost again recognize that our freedoms are a gift from heaven. Was that politically incorrect enough for you? How many agree with this? Thank you. Because I don't care if you agree with it or not, it's true. All right, you ready for number 2? I want to tell you, if you think number 1 was politically incorrect, well, you see number 2. Number 2, they would tell us that if we can do number 1, we must restore and protect the spiritual foundation of America. Did you know that the Founding Fathers, let me give you some background. I discovered, you discovered, anybody who studies the Founders will discover, that again, very closely related to step number 1. And by the way, we can be on step number 3 and you'll still think we're talking about step number 1 because they're so closely related, so you better pay attention, right? The Founding Fathers said again and again, as we've already said, there is a spiritual foundation upon which this country was built. And then did you know that George Washington warned future generations that if they did not preserve that spiritual foundation, do you know what he said? He said, the structure will fall. Whoa! Wow! Why did he say that? Was he a religious zealot imposing his own personal religious opinions on us? Or you think there might be something more? I think so. Listen to what John Adams said as to why it was so important to preserve the spiritual foundation of America. By the way, why should we pay any attention to what John Adams said? Maybe he was just one of those individuals that happened to be in the right place at the right time, and so we give him credit for being a founder. You think? I don't think so. Did you know that John Adams received more votes than any other person to be the President of the United States except George Washington? I believe that he was one of the ones that was in the know as to what the ingredients were that would make America great. Listen to why he said it was so critical to protect and preserve the spiritual foundation of America, and I quote, he said, our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. And then listen to what his older cousin Sam Adams said as to why it was so important to preserve the spiritual foundation of America. Why should we pay any attention to him? Are you kidding? Sam Adams, the father of the American Revolution, the father of American independence? Yeah, did you know that he was the first colonist in America to have a price put on his head for treason?
Yep.
Listen to why he said it was so important for us to preserve that spiritual foundation of America, and I quote, neither the wisest constitution nor the wisest laws will secure the liberty and happiness of a people whose manners are universal. Did you know that the Founding Fathers actually argued among themselves as to whether this country was even righteous? I've thought that if they were worried that their generation was not worthy of the Constitution, they'd have a coronary if they lived today.
Yeah.
Why? Because as we've already said, They knew that our freedoms were a gift from heaven, and they knew there were strings attached. They knew that we would never survive if we were not a virtuous and moral people. And so they set about to try to prepare not just their generation, but future generations to be worthy of the Constitution. I thought that was amazing. How did they do that? Oh man, we could spend all night talking about that topic, but let me give you one example so we keep the thread tying together here. First of all, in order to explain that to you, we need to understand that the founders believed something about human nature that I don't think most of you and I would disagree with. They believed that what you teach a child at home and in the schools will eventually become the standards of society. How many believe that? I heard Brian tell you that my wife and I have 7 children. Oh, that's only half the story. We have 31 grandchildren. But that came because she had a kind of a big family and I had a big family, and she makes the greatest mom, and it was a wonderful thing to have happen. But let me kind of give you an idea a little bit about where I came from. I was one of 9 children. And when my mom and dad had the kids, I came right in the middle. I'm right in the middle, number 5. But they had the kids so far apart that I had an interesting experience. I'm the last one in the family that can remember all 9 sitting around the kitchen table with mom and dad, because the olders were gone by the time the youngers one came along. And I remember those days. Back in 2004, my mom and daddy both died at 94 years of age. When they died, they had 101 progenitors. I believe they totally agree. They knew something about children. They too believed what you teach a child at home and in the schools will eventually become the standards of society. Even years, decades later, when Abraham Lincoln was around, listen to what he said. He said, the philosophy of the schoolroom in one generation will be the philosophy of government in the next.
We're screwed.
Absolutely.
And so the founders knew that they had to teach religion, morality, decency, and virtue right along with reading and writing and arithmetic in the schools as well as at home. Excuse me? Religion in the schools? Oh, scandal. Shock. GK, you must be mistaken, I have people tell me. Oh, I'm sure the founders passed laws and rules that made it so that you didn't have to teach school and religion in the schools. Really? I tell them, oh man, they really screwed up because they did it for 150 years. Oh, can you prove that? Yeah, I think so. Look at this. There was a geographical area west of the 13 colonies here in America that was known as the Northwest Territory, and you can see exactly where they were. That would be what we would call the Great Lakes area, you know, Ohio and Wisconsin and Illinois and all that area through there. That was the Northwest Territory. And at that time, they were wanting to become states. And so Congress put together what became known as the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Now I want you to think about that date for a minute. 1787? What was significant about that year?
That was when the Constitution...
That was the year the Constitution was signed. So, hey, you know, now we understand that we're on the same page, right? May I read to you one sentence out of Article 3, because the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 was the requirements that Congress said were required of the Northwest Territory if they wanted to become states. These were the requirements, and I quote, religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to what?
Good
To good government and the happiness of what? Of mankind. Schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. Notice that they did not just suggest that morality, religion be taught as a sort of a casual elective. Rather, they declared their positive conviction that these were the necessary ingredients for good government and the happiness of all mankind, and they expected it to be taught in the schools right along with the other things, because they knew what you teach a child will eventually become the standards of society, and they were doing everything in their power to protect our future. That's amazing. That wasn't casual. Boy, most people today who are liberal sure don't understand that history. And so they put that together. Well, how did they go about then actually executing that? Well, now we got to tell you about one of the most famous historians in America, or educators. His name is William Holmes McGuffey, and some of you know that name. Now, William Holmes McGuffey, being the famous educator that he was, he had an interesting philosophy about teaching children that I don't think most of us would disagree with. He believed that the only way to teach a child how to read, write, and do grammar is to read, write, and do grammar. Pretty good, right? But he did have one very important thing that made him famous, obviously, and that was that he didn't believe that it was appropriate just to pick some silly thing off the shelf to teach the children how to read and write, like run, Dick, run, Jane. See, Spot, run. Run, run, run. That tells you what generation I came from, doesn't it? No, he believed that you would take things off the shelf that were poems, stories, and illustrations that while you were teaching the child how to read, taught them how to become a better human being. Stories about things like the Golden Rule and the Ten Commandments. Ooh, the Ten Commandments? Oh, that's so Judeo-Christian. Excuse me? The Founding Fathers knew that the principles contained in the Golden Rule and the Ten Commandments were universally being taught by all sound religions of the day, including Judaism, including Hinduism, Mohammedanism. It didn't matter where you were, those were the basic principles of good living. If you don't follow those basic principles, you can't survive as a nation or a people. So it didn't matter what religion they were not worrying about what religion you belonged to. They were just talking about the very basic, most important principles of humanity. The Golden Rule applies to everybody. And the principles that we find in the Ten Commandments, that's why they taught them. And oh man, were they wound up in William Holmes McGuffey's readers. He put together a series of readers known as the McGuffey readers. There were 6 of them actually in total. But it really didn't matter to see whether you were in 1 or 6, depending on what level you were at, right? But it didn't matter. They were teaching all the same principles. They were teaching things like, for example, how important it was to teach a child how to be trustworthy. My friends, I have a question. How different would our country be today if every single child had been carefully taught by parents and by their teachers how critically it was important to be trustworthy, more than anything? Trustworthy, loyal. They taught them how important it was to be loyal to yourself and to your future and to what you really felt was truly right and wrong. Especially loyal to this amazing country that, as we're going to go talk about in a moment, had already propelled itself throughout the entire world like a tornado with its reputation of doing amazing things that none other civilization had ever done in the history of the world. Loyalty to America. Loyal, helpful, friendly, courteous, kind.
Sounds like the Boy Scouts.
They had principles, they had books and stories and illustrations to teach the little children how important it was to be kind to the less fortunate first and foremost, and then to the elderly. Right? Helpful, kind, obedient, cheerful, brave, and clean, reverent. And some of you are smiling and saying,
Boy
"Gee, I
Scouts."
think you just quoted the scout law." Well, I guess I did. Shall we get our chronology right? Did you know that in February of 2010, the Boy Scouts of America celebrated their 100th year anniversary in America? But William Holmes McGuffey taught those exact principles verbatim 200 years ago. Perhaps the Boy Scouts of America decided to emulate those principles because they too believe something. What you teach a little boy will make him a better man when he grows up. And so it goes. The McGuffey readers were so successful in teaching this material that they were considered to be all over, absolute critical all over the country. Let me tell you how successful it was. From the early 1800s to the early 1900s, over 120 million copies were dispersed throughout the schools of America. And that figure becomes phenomenal when you understand what the population of the country was at that time. What was the bottom line? Millions and millions of little boys and girls were learning the principles of virtue, morality, religion, and decency. Because the Founding Fathers discovered and knew something. They discovered that there are certain ingredients that are absolutely critical if you want to maintain freedom. And this was one of them. And so it was. How successful did it work?
Lasted a while.
Do you know that when we take the totality of all of those formulas, those those principles, those ingredients, if you will, including this concept of having to make sure that people understood that our freedoms were a gift from heaven and that we had to be able to maintain virtue or morality or we would destroy it. When you take the totality of all of the ingredients that we have, how did it work out for us? Do you know that by the early 1900s, the totality of all those ingredients made this country unbelievable in its success pattern? How many have heard the old saying, the taste is in the pudding? Do you know that by the early 1900s, this little spit of a nothing country that came out of nowhere that only represented 5 to 6% of the population of the world was now producing 50% of the entire world's wealth? 50% of the world's food, 50% of the housing, 50% of the automobiles, the telephones, etc. Wouldn't you say it worked out pretty well? My friends, do you realize that what the Founding Fathers said was successful was true? You see, we actually did have a very successful pattern. And then a very, very terrible thing happened. Early in the 1900s, some very powerful people in this country started gradually, slowly but surely, taking away out of our schools, a little here, a little there, anything that had to do with virtue, morality, religion, and decency. And the consequences have been devastating. The consequences have been devastating. When the Founding Fathers ended up suggesting that what you teach a child at home and in the schools will eventually become the standards of society, literally has come to pass. You see, what happened was in the early 1900s, by gradually, slowly but surely, pulling out of our schools anything that had to do with virtue, morality, and religion, we now have the statistics. They're as plain as day. They're not even hidden. You can go back and do your own research. You start in 1962, when a landmark ruling took place known as Engel versus Vitale, where a Supreme Court now ordered all prayers to cease. No formal prayers, no Bible reading in the scriptures, or of the scriptures, etc. in class. I'm sure the Founding Fathers would be horrified, because I now knew that the final nail had been put into the coffin. You see, what we have today is now the results. Moral decay, corruption, greed, drugs, alcohol, teenage pregnancy, and teenage suicide are rampant. You go to a school today, and what you and I once thought was disgraceful and unthinkable is today not only the norm, it is celebrated. You see, what's happening is we are in such a bad situation. No wonders that the Founding Fathers warned us to protect it. You know that this problem of morality and debauchery and loss of our moral compass has actually been at the heart of causing one of the greatest disasters in America's heritage. What is it? It is the massive destruction of the basic family structure. Immorality, debauchery, drugs, and the loss of our moral compass has been the dagger that has now been to the heart of and destroyed millions and millions of American families. If did you know the Founding Fathers stated again and again and again that a healthy family is the very core of a healthy community and the essential nerve network of a healthy America. And the fact that they recognized that today, if they saw our situation, they would stand up and they'd say, my fellow Americans, if you cannot save the family, you'll never save America. You can't save the family if you do not restore and preserve the spiritual foundation of America. You see, what we need to do is we need to go back and we need to follow the Founders' formula for education. We need to go back and teach our little ones, both at home and at school, about virtue, morality, religion, and decency, and then we can restore morality back into our personal lives, back into our family, back into our community, and back into our businesses, and then it will work its way back up into government. You see? Then we can have a foundation upon which families and freedom can exist. I want you to tell me how much of an avalanche of heartache could have been prevented across this country with millions of a family if all of our families would adhere to a strict adherence to God's moral code. It's true. And that's why the Founding Fathers said that it was so critical to preserve that spiritual foundation. Now you know why George Washington warned future generations that if they did not preserve that spiritual foundation, that the structure would fall. Because we have to understand the importance of step number 2. We cannot survive as a nation. We have the freedom, they told us, to choose. That's what it's all about. They said you have the freedom to choose whether you want to become amoral or agnostic or atheistic or whatever. That's fine. We have the freedom to do that. But if we choose to do that, we will destroy the structure that holds the Constitution together. It requires a virtuous and moral people. Has this been helpful for you to understand how important this was to the founders?
Oh, yeah.
And how that works? So that's why we have to do that. Okay, so how many agree with that? Think we're okay with that one? All right. All right, now, the next one is kind of interesting. The next one is kind of interesting because when I ask people or talk to people about the 4 steps that will save America, they don't pick the other 3. But they pick this one, at least if you know anything about our country. What is it? Step number 3. If we're going to save America, we, who's we?
People.
We must commit to learn the principles of the original Constitution as envisioned by the Founding Fathers and abide by their precepts. Now, let me give you some background so you'll appreciate how critical and important it is. When we talked a little earlier about the founders, I said something at the very beginning of our comments today that I want to reiterate. Did I not say that when we study the founders, we will discover that each and every ingredient that the founders set forth for America's success formula for peace, prosperity, and happiness and freedom, did we not say that every one of those ingredients was to the founders of the utmost value?
Yeah.
Okay, so that begs a very important question that we can now ask ourselves. What gave the right, and don't answer this in public because you'll embarrass yourself. I see this happen all the time. Yes, even here. What gave the right to those founders to come up with those ingredients? Were they experts on government? Don't make a comment. You'll embarrass yourself.
Well, they studied it.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you did this in your mind, you don't know anything.
They studied every
Are you kidding? The Founding Fathers were phenomenal experts on government. Do you know that historians tell us that when those 55 men walked into that Constitutional Convention, there was never a group of people in the history of the world that were more prepared at the right time, in the right place. I wonder who caused that to happen. Okay? Then were those 55 men when they walked into that Constitutional Convention and 4 months later walked out with the greatest document ever penned by humankind? You bet it wasn't. Did you know that they were so familiar and they were such experts on governments and all the civilizations, they didn't know how to make head or tails of it. They didn't know how to take all that information and put it together for what we should do as an America. They didn't know how to do all that. And by the way, they were all very well read and all from the same books. And I'm not talking about, oh, this was a really cool Book of the Month Club, you got to read this.
Aristotle.
Let me share one story with you to illustrate this point. You know, one of the greatest individuals that we claim to be one of the founders of this country was a gentleman by the name of Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah.
What most people don't realize is what a genius he was.
Oh, yeah.
He was brilliant, and he was a dedicated student. It was not uncommon during most of his life when he was growing up, he'd spend 15 to 18 hours a day studying. He was such a phenomenal student that when he passed the law degree, when he was 20 some odd years old, 21 or whatever, that when he went to take the bar, it's a record in our history that the professors were astonished because he knew more about the law than they did. He was a genius, but he, of all of the founders, was considered to be the genius of all the geniuses when it came to all the different civilizations of time. Now, even though that he was this amazing founder, guess what? When they had the Constitutional Convention, he wasn't even there. Do you know why? He was a minister to France from the United States. But when he found out they were going to be holding that Constitutional Convention, he was extremely worried that his really good friend James Madison be properly prepared. Do you know that we now have a record to show that Thomas Jefferson sent hundreds of books? He shipped them. He shipped hundreds of books to James Madison to read, review, and digest before he walked into the Constitutional Convention. No wonder we call James Madison the father of the Constitution. He was a walking encyclopedia when he walked into that convention. But I have to tell you, he wasn't the only one that was reading all of those books. They were all reading out of the same books. Their readings included a very broad perspective of the Greeks, the Romans, the Anglo-Saxons, European and English histories. But you know what came out of all of that education? A very devastating discovery. They discovered that the vast majority of all of those civilizations did nothing more than heap disaster and misery upon all of their citizens of those civilizations. In other words, they discovered that from the beginning of recorded history, thousands and thousands of years of civilizations had subjected billions and billions of human beings to bloodshed, bondage, and death. They discovered that almost across the board, governments were always the masters and the tyrants, and the citizens were nothing more than the servants or the slaves. But that was not to be for America. You should understand that in their studies they found there were only two civilizations, only two that they could find, that had ever had their civilization provided peace, prosperity, and happiness and freedom to their citizens. And they studied them like crazy. Thomas Jefferson discovered the first one while he was reading the Old Testament. And by the way, they were studying the Old Testament not just for religious purposes, because the Old Testament contains 4,000 years of civilization history. Thomas Jefferson was astonished to discover that the children of Israel experienced the first form of representative government ever recorded that we have time since the beginning of recorded time. And he found that when they followed those basic principles, those constitutional principles, they flourished. And when they eventually abandoned those principles, they suffered disaster. But he was very intrigued to find out where they got the magic formula for peace, prosperity, and happiness, and found that it had been revealed to the children of Israel through a man they called their prophet, Moses. And Moses said he got them from God. The founding fathers were very intrigued with those principles. I'll come back and talk about that again. But the second civilization they found, Thomas Jefferson, when they were studying the ancient civilizations of Europe, he found a civilization that was way up in the very northern part of Europe, known as the Anglo-Saxons. Powerful, powerful nation. Great warriors, great explorers, and had a profound effect upon Europe, especially upon England. But here's the reason I tell that. Thomas Jefferson was astonished to discover that even though this civilization occurred well over 1,000 years following the Israelites, he was astonished to find that their entire political form of government, including their laws, their ordinances, and their everything, was exactly the same that had been revealed to the Israelites. Verbatim. How in the world did those people get all of those laws? They followed them for centuries. In fact, later on we know that when you talk about King Alfred, he didn't even know where they got them from. They just had them forever, and they worked, and they kept very meticulous record to stay with it. So we didn't know how they got them. Someday we'll find out that, right? Someday we'll know how they got them. But they had them, and they followed them with the exact same results. And so the founding fathers really put a lot of emphasis on these two civilizations, and now we have to share this with you. They found a common denominator among those two civilizations they did not find among all the rest of the civilizations of time, and they said this is going to be the fundamental core of America. What was it? That an individual's rights are what?
God-given.
God-given as part of a divine plan and not granted by government as a political plan. I don't know anybody that summed it up better for us than good old Benjamin Franklin. He said, "Freedom is not a gift bestowed upon us by other men, but a right that belongs to us by the laws of God and nature." You know, the founders kept referring to these as the ancient principles. They couldn't get that word out of their vocabulary. Oh, these ancient principles, that, and whatever. And those ancient principles came from the God of nature and nature's own God. And that became so important. It became such a fundamental core of their philosophies that it led to the Declaration of Independence. When Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, we hear a term that most people hear because they've memorized the most common paragraph in American history and they don't even understand it. It's called inalienable rights. What does that mean? They knew what it meant. If rights are given to us by the God in heaven and not by people, they are referred to as inalienable rights. That is exactly right. And let me tell you something else you might find. I sometimes don't tell this, but you're such an electrifying audience, I can't help myself. So let me tell you more real quick. When Thomas Jefferson was given the responsibility to write the Declaration of Independence, it took him 17 days. Where did he spend all of his time? You should be interested to know that the vast majority of all the Declaration of Independence explains all of the wrongs that King George had done. That's the vast majority. There's only one part at the very beginning that lists a very important part of the Declaration of Independence, but the vast majority was written. You know where? He already had them written down. He already had the Virginia Resolves. It was part of the Constitution he wanted to put together for Virginia. He already had all of the part of the Declaration of Independence where he was listing all the grievances. But he spent 16 days on that one little paragraph at the beginning. Those are where we get the following. 16 days. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain what? Unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Did you know that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are not necessarily specific rights? They're categories of rights. Where did he get them from? 16 days. He toiled over Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Because those are where the God in heaven revealed our inalienable rights. Is this country built upon a spiritual foundation? You see how important this was to the founders? Wow. How did it work out for us, ladies and gentlemen? Are you kidding? Do you know that we live in one of history's most unique moments? We live in a nation of time of almost unprecedented freedom. Do you know that even with all of our problems today, the freedoms that you and I experience has only been experienced by less than 1% of the entire human family since the beginning of recorded time? Are you kidding? I love this slide. It's a slide of two of my grandchildren at a 4th of July parade in what could be anywhere in America. It turned out it was in Ohio. I love this slide because it shows what we are able to do in America. Here is a 4th of July parade that would be illegal in most countries of the world. Our getting together tonight for this meeting would be illegal in most countries of the world. Wouldn't you think that the ingredients put together by those founders that was inspired by heaven turned out to be a pretty darn good blessing for us? And it's worth fighting over. And then a sad thing happened. Starting in the early 1900s. Oh my gosh, here comes that date again. Starting in the early 1900s, some very, very powerful people in this country who created and built their wealth, I might add, by following the very same principles that we've been teaching about, but somehow they lost confidence in the founders for a variety of reasons, including self-serving reasons. And they were so powerful and so influential that it led to literally thousands of individuals all across the country standing up on podiums and pulpits declaring the new word, the new message. What was the new message?
Progressive.
Ladies and gentlemen, our Constitution is now outdated. It is no longer valid in our day and age. It was written for a whole bunch of people a long time ago in an agrarian society that didn't understand America's problems. And a lot of the people said, I'm sorry, you're full of bunk. Because there were so many people who were patriotic. They loved the founders, and they loved America. And so they started to create an environment where we lost our freedoms. I'll share with you how that happened.
Public school system.
But before I tell you the exact process that occurred to make it happen, I need to warn you that Thomas Jefferson warned it could happen. Is he worth quoting?
Yeah.
The genius of all the geniuses of the civilizations of time. You know what he said? He said, my fellow Americans, be very careful, because in a republic government, would that be a government of the people, for the people, and by the people, like Abraham Lincoln said?
Yeah.
That means the power lies where?
With the people.
With the people. He said, be very careful. Because he says, when the people possess the power, there will be a natural tendency to gradually, slowly but surely, little by little, to start to depend upon the federal government to give them everything. He said, please, make sure you don't do that, because he says, if you do that, you will discover the aftermath. If you start to depend upon the federal government to give them everything, you will find that every time that you depend on the government to give you anything, you will have to trade off a freedom, and a freedom here and a freedom there. And eventually you will find that freedom will be placed with our oppression and tyranny. And he said, and you'll know when that has occurred, when the federal government has bureaus, departments, laws, rules, and regulations that regulate every aspect of your life. Are we there?
Yes.
Did he not warn us? It sounds like he knew something. Okay, he warned that it would happen, and then he warned, now here's how it can be solved. And you know what? The solution was so simple, we didn't pay attention to it. We let it slip away. He said, the solution is education. He said, when you have a government that is only authorized by the people, and all the power lies with the people in a representative government, it will be absolutely critical that every man, woman, and child be so familiar with our Constitution and our unique form of government that that way they will be so well educated that they will stand up and jealously protect every single freedom from ever being given away to the federal government before it occurs. He said, what he basically said was, freedom, knowledge, a knowledge of freedom will lead, political information will lead to freedom, but political ignorance will lead to usurpation and oppression. Now that I've given you that background, now you'll understand the following quote that's so short, but most people don't understand what it means, but now you will. Here's what he said. If a nation expects to be ignorant and free, it expects what never was and never will be. He knew that if we ever became unknowledgeable on our Constitution and our unique form of government, we'll lose it. And so they felt so strong about this that they required that a curriculum of education be absolutely the fundamental core also of the schools, of the kids at home and in the schools. Right along with religion, morality, and religion, and so on, virtue and morality. Remember we talked about that? And so here's an interesting point. In history, we know that one of the great textbooks that these kids were required to absolutely swim in, it was a big part of their curriculum, was a textbook called the Catechism of the Constitution. It's actually called the Elementary Catechism of the Constitution of the United States, but you got the point. It was written by a man by the name of Arthur Stansbury, and it came out just about the same time as the McGuffey Readers. And man, was it a quite a little thick textbook. Do you know it had over 150 questions along with the answers about our unique form of government, about our Constitution, and about separation of church and state. Oh, that was a bad slip.
Yeah, you're not kidding.
It explained about separation of powers, both vertically and horizontally. It explained all about the different parts and how that freedoms were given as a gift from heaven and not created by the government, etc. And it went on and on. And they had to learn that little textbook backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards and upside down. You could say they had it memorized. And that was for what? So little boys and girls would grow up to be big boys and girls, and if they ever heard a law that was being proposed that was not constitutionally sound, they recognized it in a heartbeat and would say, "I don't think so." And that was what made this country great. So, what happened then to create what happened in the 1900s to be able to make it so that we ended up becoming experts on the government? People were so patriotic. They loved the founders. The people in very powerful positions in our government and in the schools said the solution is long-term. Quit teaching Americans about our Constitution like we did in the past. And they gradually, slowly but surely started stripping out all of the time we used to spend. A little here, a little there. Little here and little there. Culminating in 1957. Is anybody here in high school in 1957? In 1957, I have a friend that's just a little older than me, and he tells the story they called a great big assembly in high school. Up to that particular point in time, the students had to take 2 full years of the following. They had to take a full year from a textbook called civics. And they had to take another full year from another one called American history. Civics told about all the Constitution and the founders and how they come up with all those ideas. This was major study. You really had to know that material. And they called a great big assembly, and they said to everybody, "Guess what? You're going to like this. We're no longer going to be teaching civics and American history anymore. We're going to condense it into a 6 or a half a year course. And because it's just a kind of an overview of everything, it can be taught, instead of by a specialized teacher, can be taught by the coach, if the coach has got time to work it in." That's not taking away from the coach. That is just taking away from the fact that it didn't require an expert to teach it anymore. And my friend Dr. Kimber says that he'll never forget. He was all excited like the other kids. "Yay, this is going to be great. Oh, how great." He says he looked over and he saw the American teacher history who'd gotten a degree in history so he could teach it backwards and forwards to the kids. And he looked and he says the teacher had tears streaming down his face. And the teacher said, "Today will be a bad day for America." And I want you to know that I'm a student of that education afterward. And I graduated from high school. I thought I had a pretty good education. I could read and write, and I thought I could do pretty good math, not as good as some. And I remember studying the Constitution, or so I thought. I remembered studying the Founding Fathers, or so I thought. Turned out to be it was just a cursory overview of a few things that happened. It took me as an adult many years later to realize I know nothing. I know absolutely nothing. I knew so little, along with millions and millions of other Americans, just like most of you in this room, that know so little about our Constitution that if we hear a law being proposed that is constitutionally unsound, we have no clue. But we still love America. And that would bring me to why that if the Founding Fathers were here, I know that Thomas Jefferson would stand up in front of this group with a tear in his eye and he'd say, "Ladies and gentlemen, you did it. You did it. You quit teaching the Constitution to every man, woman, and child in this country, and today you know nothing." He said, if we were to give you a test, even though you spent all your life in this country, you have no idea where the founders arrived at a formula for a constitutional government. And to prove my point that you don't know anything, and now I'm going to ask you a question so we don't have to embarrass everybody. You are the core of patriotism. Please don't be offended when I use this as an example. I'm driving a very important point because I guarantee that Thomas Jefferson would do it. He would say, "You know so little about our Constitution that, ladies and gentlemen, how many of you love America? You only love America this much or this much? How many of you love our Constitution? Are you ready for this? How many of you in this room can tell me how many articles there are in the Constitution?" One person in the entire room? You are absolute constitutional ignoramuses, exactly as Thomas Jefferson would tell you. And I was just as guilty. Am I driving a point home?
No.
We know nothing. And that's why the Founding Fathers would tell us that's why you lost it. Because exactly as what Thomas Jefferson said. What was it he made the comment back there? What was it he said? If a nation expects to be ignorant and free, it expects what never was and never will be. We're losing it. And so, my friends, I want you to know that to save this country, we have to turn a new leaf. To save this country, you must get a copy of the Constitution and be able to read it, and you need to understand it. And if you haven't read it, it is not an easy document to read because it's written in Old English. But I will promise you something. If you will study it, and you will ponder it, and you start to understand it, it will emblazon your bones. It is the greatest document ever. But most people don't know anything about it. So a bunch of us came to this point in my presentation, and we started to say, we're hypocrites. We're going out and showing people that they don't know anything about the Constitution and telling them that the answer to solving our problems is to understand the Constitution. We have to do something to help you do that. So let me tell you what we did. Three of my other partners, the four of us put together the Glorious Cause of America Institute. There's others that do it too. We wanted to help. We knew that we had to do something to help make and help you to be able to redeem and protect this land. So we put together the Glorious Cause of America Institute. There's our website. If you want to go back and read the free material on our blog, you better write it down. But can I just make a little plea right here so I can tell you this right up front? I have never charged a dime for going around the country and doing one of these presentations, but it still costs lots of money. And it finally came to the point that none of us have that much of it deep pockets. So we just plead with you, my friends, we need all the donations we can receive. If you feel that this message is an important message to go around, I hope you'll be generous when we leave and help us out. I don't take a dime for myself, but it sure helps to cover the cost of the airline tickets and the hotels and a few things like that so we can proclaim the message. I will hope you do that. But in the process of doing that, I want to tell you what we did do. We put together the best training course we know how to make you so you can come up to speed. Here's what we did. If a person, we put together on our website, when a person enrolls in this program, you'll get access to our website, and it has several hours, 32 hours to be exact, of constitutional training material, and it's broke up into 4 8-hour courses. And here's what happens. We didn't come up with this manual. There was a group, a fantastic group called the Thomas Jefferson Center for Constitutional Studies that's put together a marvelous manual of study material. So what we did is we got a hold of those manuals, and each one of these manuals, when you enroll in the program, you get a copy of it, and you get to go through this manual live while we go through 8 hours of instruction on our website. And so let me tell you what's in each manual. The first manual is known, oh, by the way, if you donate at least $199 towards our cause, we'll donate back to you the entire program for you and your family to be able to study and read. And it will really help us. It helps us to cover the cost of this plus all the rest of the process. Okay, let me show you how it's in it. First manual. This is a copy of it. You'll actually get it. It's called God's Hand in Building America. You remember when we read the story today a little, or told you the story about George Washington? We call it the Bulletproof George Washington. There is that story in here along with several others. Then one more I'm going to share with you tonight before we leave. But it talks about this tapestry of things that occurred by the Creator to create this America long before this America was a grand old US of A. Then the next one, and this, oh, by the way, that is all, oh, I already told you that. That's where that story that occurred. Second one, God's Hand in Building, where did I do that? Back here. There we go. The Founders' Charter of Freedom. Here's your Constitution. You may not be able to understand the Constitution right now because it's in Old English, but we'll go through it paragraph by paragraph, concept by concept, and we will tell you kind of what it means and what's involved. That will be where you'll start to understand it. Won't it be nice to be able to be a little bit more informed on that? And you know what's going to happen when you read that? You're going to say, oh, I can see where we went wrong. Oh, but then if you think that's bad, wait till you see the third manual. Oh, I got to share this one with you. Before I get there, I get ahead of myself. Charter of Freedom. This was such a spiritual experience. at the end of the Constitutional Convention, when the men came forward and started to sign that document, they were emotionally moved. I wish I'd have been a fly on the wall to watch those men come through and sign that document. James Madison, who was the father of the Constitution, sat right up in the front next to George Washington and wrote everything that went down during the entire conference. He testified of something that just, wow. He says that when Benjamin Franklin came forward to sign that document, he was so moved that he said that as he was signing the document, James Madison said, the old man wept. I believe you will too. The Founders' Charter of Freedom, and the third one, the attacks on the Charter of Freedom. You will know exactly who it was and why and what their motivation was over the last 100 years that started to change and disassemble the Constitution that was envisioned by the Founding Fathers. Now let me make a point so I can say this again and again before I'm done with the presentation, and you'll have it memorized by the time I'm done. Ladies and gentlemen, you will never have the power to solve America's problems if you cannot look at every problem we have today and know what part of the Constitution was broken to create that problem. Please hear me say that. You do not have the power to change this country if you don't know what caused the problem. All across America, people tell me, I love America. I know we have problems, but I don't know what caused it or what to do about it. You're right. But if you know what part of the original Constitution was broken to cause every single problem we're having today, you now have the power to solve it. Does that make sense? And that brings me to the fourth manual. That being the case, now you know what caused the problem. Now, what are your specific marching orders to help solve the problem? And we have a whole manual. We found out that across America there were lots of really good companies who were teaching about the Constitution, but none of them will actually say, okay, here's what you need to do to solve the problem. But it's here. And I think you will find this particular program to be changing. Now, one more little quick thing. We found that a lot of parents came up and said, yeah, but you know what? Our kids are the ones that need to understand this. And they have no interest. They say this stuff is boring. So one of my partners, Cameron Taylor, is an author. He's written several books, and he says, I'm going to do what I can. You know what he did? He wrote a novel. It's a very fun, interesting reading novel. It tells the story about the Vice President of the United States being near assassinated. The country thinks he's been assassinated, but he was almost assassinated, but he's in a coma and he's in a hospital. Now, to make a little twist on things, to make it really interesting for the kids to read, you know, the teenagers, etc., what happens to the Vice President is he has a near-death experience and he goes over on the other side and he meets up with the Founding Fathers. And those Founding Fathers teach them the principles they need to know today. You know, those kids, when they read that story, they think they're reading a really exciting story, but in the process of doing it, they're learning about these very fundamental principles. And then the book ends by being able to have the Vice President go back to life and then start to change America. And I think your kids will love that. And so there we have the course, and by the way, there's a little DVD that is a presentation I gave before a live audience at a theater, and it's all there for you to show your friends and families, etc. and whatnot. But it's all there because we want you to be able to do that. My friends, listen. You've got to get a copy of the Constitution and read it, and you've got to understand it, and you've got to fall in love with it because you're the only ones left to defend it. Am I over the top with this?
No.
Ladies and gentlemen, you're the core that needs to solve America's problems. But we're only putting Band-Aids on when we get together and say, well, we need to pass some bill about that and some bill about that and pass this and resend that one. For every one of those Band-Aids you put on, 10 more problems will come. You need to go to the source. We need to look back and say, what part of the original Constitution was broken to create the problem? And you could save America. And you know then what's going to happen? All of a sudden you have an amazing power because you know what constitutionally trained means. And now you can go out and when a person says, I want to run for office, you'll say, okay, let's have a discussion. What do you know about the Constitution? You know nothing. Sorry, we're not voting you in or you'll be just like everybody in the last 100 years. If Thomas Jefferson were here, he would say, my fellow Americans, thank you so much for being patriotic. But in the last 100 years, You become so ignorant about our Constitution that you've been voting in people who are patriotic just like you, but they don't know anything. And those individuals have chipped away at every major clause of our Constitution until today we face a major crisis. But no more. Because we're going to have a population of ignorant, we're going to have a segment of the population who are educated. You're going to be so well educated that you're going to turn over every stone until you find those individuals that have two qualities. Number one, they're constitutionally trained, and number two, they're honest. Before you ever put them into office, they will have proved themselves to have integrity. Do you know why I say that? Because the Founding Fathers knew something about human nature that's just as true today as it was in their days. They said, be careful because politics tend to corrupt people. Oh, imagine that. They said it's very important that you end up finding people who are so honest that they can't be bought through power, money, authority, and fame, and popularity, and sex, and everything else that goes with it. They said if you will vote in people who are constitutionally trained and honest, they will have such powerful integrity they can't be bought, and they'll shake the very halls of Washington into constitutional compliance. But you're not going to be able to find those people if you don't know what kind of people have to be in there in the first place. You've got to be constitutionally trained. So the bottom line is, stand up, defend the Constitution by becoming constitutionally trained, and then we're going to be able to save this country. And you're not going to be able to do that if you do not understand and commit to learn the principles of the original Constitution and abide by its principles. Write this in your notes, please. You will never help this. You do not have the power to save America if you cannot look at a problem and know what part of the original Constitution was broken to create it. That's power. And that's what we need to do. Okay, the last one is very quick. It doesn't take very long. We'll start to wind down. Number 4 is so applicable to our age that if the Founding Fathers were here, they would say, my fellow Americans, because of your current state of affairs, what I'm going to tell you is more important today than any time in the history of this country. You are going to have to become personally involved in civic affairs. What that means is that as citizens of this incredible country, we can no longer be idle spectators, not anymore. You got to get constitutionally trained. Did we talk about that? And then you got to stand up and let other people know how you feel. How do you let other people know how you feel? How about voting? Is that pretty good? Yeah. How about writing letters? Is that okay? Yeah. Those are wonderful, but they're not the best way. You know what the best way we find to let other people know how you feel? Why, you're willing to serve on school boards, county commissions, and city councils. We don't have enough of you. It is amazing we're finding out that you can have one person in a city council or county commission who's willing to listen, and when they hear a law being proposed that is constitutionally unsound, they stand up and say, well, I don't think so. And you explain it to them, and it's changing this country in a lot of places. Some of you in this room have never aspired to position or leadership in political positions. I don't really care. You know what? Maybe you're the very ones we need because you are not the kind of a person to be swayed by political power. But I'm going to tell you this. If you want a country for your great grandkids to be in, you have got to take the time out of your schedule and your love of America to serve in those positions. My friend, somebody said something not too long ago that I think is so applicable that I had to put it up on a slide. You are going to have to do politics, or politics are going to do you. And so it is, my friends. More than any time in the history of the country, please become constitutionally trained and let others know how you feel. It is more critical now that you must become personally involved in civic affairs. And there you have it. There are the 4 steps that will save America. If we can do number 1 and understand and recognize what a great blessing it is that this is the greatest country in the history of the world because the God in heaven made it so. And you can't study this history in depth without understanding and appreciating it because the founders did. And you have to understand that the founders knew that unless we're a virtuous and moral people, basically we cannot save this country. George Washington knew exactly what he was talking about. When he made that prediction, that if we didn't preserve it, that the structure would fall, he was not merely expressing his personal opinion. He was declaring a factual warning of cause and effect. And then we need to commit to learn the principles so that you'll have the knowledge to know how to solve the problems, and then you're going to solve it. What do you think? Do you think there's some merit to what we've said?
Yes.
All right, now, people come up to me all the time and they say, well, GK, that's really nice what you said, but it's too late. They'll say, do you know that we're so far down the path of destruction, it can't be saved? And by the way, they believe it. Do you know that last year over 200,000 Americans gave up their citizenship and moved because they know we've gone to hell? I want you to know that people come up to me all the time, like my son, some with tears in their eyes, and say, I love America, but my efforts are too small. What difference do I make? And I tell them that you're all wrong. You don't understand something. I believe with all my heart we will save this country. And the reason is because they don't understand something. They don't understand that they don't have to do this to save this country. They need to understand that there is a power mightier than we, that we can call upon. And with that, I want to tell you a story to end up closing out on. I want to tell you a story that took place clear back in October of 1746. At that time, France was at war with England. What greater vengeance do you think France might inflict upon England than wage a devastating battle on the colonies here in America? And I've had people say, well, I don't get that. I understand that France was at war with England, but why in the world do they want to come over here? I understand that there was a bunch of English people over here, but really, let me tell you something. Did you know that 1/4, 25% of the entire population of England came over to America? Packed up and left. 1 out of every 3 families in England had family members over here in America. Oh yeah, an attack on the colonies was an attack on England. And this was not an idle threat. France put together a fleet of 140 ships. 40 of these ships were frigates of war loaded with cannon power and fighter power. 100 of these ships were transport ships carrying over 10,000 troops, and they were under the direction of a very famous admiral whose name was D'Anville. We now have his orders. His orders were direct and to the point: burn Boston to ashes, and then proceed to destroy every colony along the eastern seaboard possible before returning back to the West Indies. And my friends, they were on their way. Now, theoretically, there would be no hope for those colonists at that time to be able to protect themselves from such firepower and manpower. Did you know that was 30 years before the Declaration of Independence had even been signed? But guess what? Oh, they had a very powerful defense. We now know from history these were God-fearing people. They were very religious. They came over here because of a very powerful motivation for God, country, and family, not wealth. And so it comes as no surprise that Governor Shirley declared a universal day of fasting and praying. And on the appointed day, they flocked to the churches. We know that in Boston on that particular day, the sun was shining. They walked to church in the sunshine. The famous Reverend Thomas Prince stood up in the Old South Church in Boston. If you haven't been there, I hope you go there someday. It's there. It's still there today. That's where Sam Adams rallied everybody together for the Tea Party. Oh, it's a great place to go visit. The Reverend Thomas Prince stood up before hundreds as he pleaded with the God in heaven to save this country. And the congregation said, many of them said in all the years that he served there, it was almost 40 years, if I remember correctly, they'd never heard a prayer like they heard that day. Reverend Thomas Prince looked up in the heavens and he said, oh God, deliver us from our enemies. Send thy tempest, Lord, upon the waters to the east. Raise thy right hand. Scatter the ships of our tormentors and drive them hence. Sink their proud frigates beneath the power of the winds. Wow, did he deliver a powerful prayer. And then they said no sooner had he said the words than the sun was gone. The sky went dark. Wind shrieked around the outside walls of the church. The wind was so powerful it was like a giant hand beating on the windows. They said the wind was so strong that the great big bell up in the belfry tower rang twice from the power of the winds. Recognizing what was happening, Reverend Thomas Prince looked back up into the heavens and he said, oh God, we hear thy voice. Thy breath is upon the waters to the east, even upon the deep. Thy bell tolls for the death of our enemies. And then they said he paused, and when he looked down at the podium, the Spirit was so strong the tears were streaming down his face. And he looked back up in the heavens and he said, thine be the glory, Lord. Thine be the glory. Amen and amen. Wow, what a prayer. The reputation of his prayer spread all over New England, but guess what? It didn't really matter because everybody in New England already knew about the amazing hurricane that just came up out of nowhere at the right time in the right place. even in the middle of the sunshine. Governor Shirley sent out a sloop called the Rising Sun out into the ocean to bring back news as to what had hardly. When the news came back, it was too miraculous to even believe. The whole of the French fleet was nearly lost. But there was more. Over the next few days, survivors said that in addition to the winds, a deathly pestilence had come upon the ships. Thousands died at sea. Thousands more were so sick they couldn't even get on their feet. Admiral D'Anville was so overcome with grief and despair, he ordered poison and committed suicide. Following which the Vice Admiral pulled out his own sword and drove it through his own heart, also committing suicide. The remaining ships, half-manned, limped back out to sea, mission unaccomplished. Historians today have gone back and said that at that critical time in our history, if that mission had been accomplished, it is a sure thing that the Americas would not be the United States of America. But I venture to say, my friends, that the God in heaven knew it. I want you to know that it's amazing to understand that how amazingly those new colony prayers have been answered. Wind, pestilence, death. Yeah, how amazing their prayers have been answered. Now I should tell you one little epitaph you might be interested. One great scholar tells us that there was a 10-year-old boy in that congregation when Reverend Prince was pleading with the God in heaven to save this country. And that little 10-year-old boy's name was John Adams. And he later said it was on that day he became a patriot. My friends, now you understand, I'm going to predict something. I want you to know that we don't have to save this country by ourselves. I am convinced that if you commit to learn these 4 principles and you abide by them and you start teaching them to your children as best as you can and your grandchildren, and you put the influence where you can, you will see an amazing miracle that will occur that you can tell your great-grandchildren about. I believe that the same God who saved this country over 200 years ago will again unleash the powers of heaven and reach down and magnify yours and my efforts by 1,000,000-fold to save this country. You don't have to save this country, my friends. The God in heaven will do it, but the requirement will be you have to, to the best of your ability, follow these 4 principles, and that will trigger and unleash the powers of heaven. I believe that with all my heart. Now do you understand? My gosh, we have a great future. I am convinced we will save this land. I have been so moved to come across the country and teach thousands of people like you, who I found out are good, honorable, God-fearing people. And there's enough of us that if we can unite and band together, we truly will be able to solve this problem. And so there you have it. You know, in 1826, in closing, I should tell you this, in 1826, it was July. There were 2 men lay dying on their deathbeds. They weren't even in the same location. One of them was Thomas Jefferson. We know that as he lay there on his bed, he asked someone in the room, and by the way, some of you probably been there in that bedroom. I've been there, and there's a real sweet spirit there. I want you to know that Thomas Jefferson asked someone in the room, what day is it? July the 3rd, he was told. And he declared in his he declared in absolute terms that he wanted to live one more day so he could breathe the air of the 50th anniversary of this country's independence. I guess you could say I'm a hopeless romantic. I'm sure glad he got his promise, but he did. On July the 4th, 1826, on the appointed hour of his death, he thanked his servants and his friends for having taken care of him. And then, in very clear terms, he said, I resign myself to God and to my country and to my child. And he quietly passed away. But isn't it an absolute miracle? I think it's more than a miracle. It's too much for a miracle. There has to be more to it than that. On the exact same day, in a complete different location, John Adams was breathing his last words. We now know that the very last 2 words that he offered to the public were the words, independence forever. That's where I got the name of my presentation. This great man, 80 years earlier, as a 10-year-old boy, sat there and listened to Thomas Prince pleading with the God in heaven to save his country. And as I told you before, many said that he said it was on that day he became a patriot. I have a question for you, ladies and gentlemen. Would you agree that on that day, that was a great day for America?
Yes.
My friends, it's the same thing. Do you realize that if any of you, I'm sure there's not a one of you, if any of you leave this room that has not truly dedicated yourself to be a patriot, if you change and you walk out of here today a true patriot, this will be a great day for America, because I'm going to tell you something. America needs you. My friends, if you love America, if you love the Founding Fathers, or would like to get to know them better as I did, if you are concerned about America's future, and especially if you want to be able to help in healing this country, then for heaven's sake commit to be a true patriot and dedicate the rest of your life to implementing these 4 steps. I want you to know that I'm convinced that if enough of us can band together and again unite and work and fight as did our inspired Founding Fathers, we will save this land. How much effort is it to require? Do you know how much did George Washington give to this country? Do you know that he worked all those years as the commander of the Revolutionary War for 8 years and never took a dime in salary? He asked to be reimbursed for his expenses. It nearly bankrupted his home at Mount Vernon. And if that wasn't enough, he then was he was the president of the Constitutional Convention. And then they asked him to be president of the United States. They authorized him to receive $25,000 a year as a salary. He served 2 terms and never took it. How much of a sacrifice can you make for this country? How about making a sacrifice enough? How about making a sacrifice enough that you might be able to become involved in our constitutional training program? Please help us. Please help us. Do everything you can. You know, I want you to know that if you can just donate anything to help us to pass this message on, it will really, really help. And just to show you where my heart's in the right place, I made the comment that every donation counts, but if you donate at least $199 or more, we will donate an entire training program to you and your family. But I want to make one other promise to you tonight. I have in my briefcase, I need to get them back there for you, and I think enough DVDs of a presentation, this presentation. Would you think this presentation might be something valuable to show your children or grandchildren, your friends or neighbors? Yeah. It was pre-recorded, a live audience in front of a movie theater, and I think I have enough of them that when you stop at the back of the table, by the way, you've got the forms inside your kit, right?
Yes.
You fill out the forms, and you can do that, or I don't care what you donate, any amount, I don't care what it is, I'll give you a free DVD to take home and share with your families. I don't care what it is, no matter what. And like I say, if you donate a little bit more, we'll be happy to donate the whole package to you. So in closing, I want you to know that I am thrilled. Do you think I'm a little passionate about this material, or should I retire?
Don't retire.
Ladies and gentlemen, my fellow Americans, with all the sincerity that I can develop, I hope you'll feel this. I pray that the God in heaven will bless you and your families. Not just for your sakes, but for America's sake. I pray God will bless you. You have great aspirations for your family and for your loved ones. I pray for you and for those too. But wouldn't it be appropriate also, while doing that, to also say, ladies and gentlemen, God bless you.